Oh, by the way, somebody say systematic theology to me here in a few minutes, because I didn't put it in my notes, but I want to make a comment. So remember that, right?
Systematic theology.
Systematic theology, in a few minutes. You'll probably say it a couple times, I'll be like, no, not yet. But anyway. Okay, so let's do a brief recap of yesterday. What I was trying to get to, the point that I was trying to make yesterday, is to really have a rebuttal for the Calvinist juggernaut of destruction. You have to learn to argue the central roots of their claims. Ultimately, what they're trying to do, where's my handy-dandy pointer, is argue for the right for an alternate reality, one that is not this reality here in this earth at this time. They use a lot of different argumentative tactics to make that possible. Top of the list is they like to make a claim to orthodoxy. Orthodoxy is ultimately a claim to authority. I showed you the algebra of authority yesterday. But ultimately, orthodoxy has no identity, because at any given moment, at any given time, they can make whatever claim they want about what the sources of that orthodoxy happens to be, and oh, by the way, decided something else the next minute. So that you end up with this endless both-and proposition, which I pointed out is ultimately a violation of Aristotle's law of identity. A isn't A. A is A or B. We're going to pick up there. This is my web of tyranny. All tyrannies have these 5 fundamental categories of arguments. It doesn't matter the ideology. I don't care if we're talking Marxism. I don't care if we're talking fascism. I don't care if we're talking Calvinism. At the end of the day, they all fundamentally revolve through these 5 pillars. We talked about authority. What is authority?
Force.
Force. That is exactly right. Anytime a man makes a claim to authority, he is ultimately saying he has the right to compel you to whatever he wants you to do. Why do they need force? Because they must be able to compel you to accept their version of reality. Of course, they get fussy when you don't let them. So, let us talk about this. When you call them on the fact that they really are not appealing to an objective truth, the conversation goes something like this. We are going to revisit our friend Grace Ryder Randy because he's anecdotal for a very important, let me make sure I actually have objective truth. Oh, you know what? That is not my comments. Base, 1 second. Hang on. Here we go. So, a discussion on the issue of objective truth. So, in my comments to Paul on Paul's passing thoughts about the conversation with Grace Ryder Randy, I made these observations. I said, Paul, well, this is me talking generally, but specifically to Paul, no matter how often you peg Randy into a Calvinist corner, he will wave the magic wand of his whim and sidestep the issue because he doesn't believe that. He is not intellectually accountable to any objective standard. No matter how many scriptures you stack in service to illustrating progressive justification, he will never concede. No matter how many times you quote Calvin or Luther or any neo-Cal luminaries to illustrate the doctrinal error endemic to the Protestant house of cards, he will pretend that they are some fringe, inconsequential distributors of non-essential doctrines. And it doesn't really matter up here, whatever this wand he chooses to wave it over, it doesn't matter what you're talking about. As long as he doesn't happen to think that's true, that's all that matters. And I want to point this out right here. He is not intellectually accountable to any objective standard. These are fighting words to Calvinists. Remember I closed out the session yesterday? Be forewarned. When you start challenging the Calvinist infrastructure of authority, then that's when they start to get fussy. but it's very crucial and important you understand what little intellectual sleight of hand they're going to do here to fool you. So let's discuss this. I made this comment on the blog, and this was Randy's response. John, the A, B, and C, I put those in there. He didn't write these. Basically, this is one consistent thought from him where I broke it down because we're going to analyze this in turn. John, I am intellectually accountable to one objective standard and one objective standard alone. That standard is the Word of God, interpreted according to widely accepted principles of interpretation. It is that standard I intend to rely on. Okay, you're going to see this answer over and over and over from Calvinists. Let's dissect part A. Here's my challenge. My challenge is Randy is not intellectually accountable to an objective standard. Randy's rebuttal: Randy is accountable to the objective Word of God. Specifically, a book. So here's the loose logic. Because there is a book that is metaphysically existent, the book qualifies as objective. So, since this book exists, the content herein is metaphysically and epistemologically objective. That's the logic. By the way, this is the book that I wrote. For those of you who don't know, please buy it. I'm a capitalist, so I need to make some money.
Therefore, it makes it objective.
That's right. I'm a capitalist, therefore it makes it objective. You pay money for it, you get the idea. That was really funny. Come on. Now look, I understand Randy doesn't say book here, but unless he's actually talking about hearing God's voice, at the end of the day, he's talking about a book, right? So here's the sleight of hand. Because the book full of words exists, he is accountable to something that everyone can perceive, therefore he is accountable to the objective. Did you follow that? Because the book contains God's words, Randy's mind is accountable to its content. So then it logically follows that Randy's ideas are the product of an objective standard. The book exists, therefore the rational standard is objective. That's the loose logic. Do you see it in the progression? All right. So here's the analysis. So just because somebody thumps their modern day ESV, touches it, fingers it, fondles it, doesn't make the ideas extracted from the words objective. Any more than touching a rock makes a stonemason understand how to create a statue. Randy is doing what Calvinist defenders do. They are mixing and matching metaphysical expectations with epistemological conclusions. So that's the 75-cent way of saying they're discussing the issue of metaphysics here, right? It is the book existentially exists. And then deciding that because it exists, that their epistemology is then therefore flawless. In other words, what they understand about reality in their own existence, in their own time frame, in their own self, in their own person, and in their own brain, that this is epistemologically true. So they're mixing and matching these two elements of philosophy. Well, it's all fundamental error. And here's why it is error. He is casually overlooking the rational individual process required to grasp the objective words written on the page. And I use the word objective here in quotes. How many cognitive, conceptual integrations do you have to get to, do you have to perform in your mind to get to any doctrinal conclusion? How many conceptual integrations do you have to go through just to get to the point of literacy? We got some teachers in the audience here. How many things do kids have to learn to do intellectually before they understand the concept of C-spot run? And we haven't even gotten around to them understanding for God so loved the world. And and the implications behind reading a Bible passage. And this is the sleight of hand that Calvinists are constantly doing. They want to pretend that there is no individual conceptual understanding, any individual cognitive process. Therefore, this Word of God leaps fully formed into their mind, and then they are appealing to something that is a quote-unquote objective. Well, this is absurd.
Well, John, if I may add, that goes back to the conversation that Paul was having with us before when he was describing this math problem in his nursing class. The point is their practical application of the problem was irrelevant.
Yes.
It was the fact that all you needed to know was how to do it.
The theory behind
If you do this, you will arrive at this answer, and whether or not it actually has any practical application to what you're doing with it is irrelevant.
Correct. For those of you watching online, Andy is referring to a conversation we had during lunch. Paul made an observation in a class he was involved with, where the class was discussing an entirely theoretical process that had no practical application in reality. You wouldn't actually do the practice if you were confronted with it in a situation. And Andy's comment goes to the fulcrum here is the difference between what is in fact theoretical versus what is in fact reality-based. Randy here is ultimately conflating literacy with objectivity. And that's foolishness. How can something be objective that requires the ability to read, which is a highly subjective human process, before the standard can even be realized? So you had to learn how to read long before you ever picked up a Bible and started pointing to it and insisting this was actually your intellectual standard. The fact is, literacy is just the beginning of the long chain, the long epistemological and conceptual chain an individual must progress through before they end up with a formal doctrinal declaration. You understand what I just said there? There is an entire ocean of intellectual conclusions that you had to get to before you ever come up with any advanced doctrinal assertion. Or said another way, hundreds of highly individual cognitive evolutions are integrated with incalculable subjective conclusions long before a person can declare intellectual solidarity with any writing. Do you see the evasion here? Randy has to ultimately blank out his own personal, highly subjective cognitive process to arrive at the conclusion that this book he has over here is his quote-unquote objective standard. They have no awareness of the individual decisions they make to arrive at their conclusion. So here is really the Calvinist tautology. This is what this looks like. The definition of biblical is what Calvinists think. What Calvinists think is the definition of biblical. The definition of biblical is what Calvinists think. What Calvinists think is the definition of biblical. And this is why, remember I told you yesterday, every time they go, well, I'm a Calvinist, but I don't believe that. The Bible says, remember I told you it's a gambit. It's a gambit to return to what they think they have the monopoly on. Ultimately, at the end of the day, what they think is the definition of biblical. Which is why you never gain any traction in a quote-unquote biblical conversation with a Calvinist, ever. Because they think that what they think is the authority. So, and then to add insult to epistemological injury, they think the objective is what they think. And this is the fraud underneath the entire body of logic. Which is why they fight so hard over the right to interpret. So now let's talk about part B. So did I put that on here? So here's part B of Randy's response to me. The standard is the Word of God, interpreted according to widely accepted principles of interpretation. Okay, so what's the obvious question here?
Whose interpretation?
Widely accepted by whom? right? What this really betrays here is that Calvinists really think objectivity equals consensus.
Right. Consensus of the reformers, the Puritans.
Whatever this historical, this fictitious historical record happens to be.
Historical precedent.
Yeah, okay, yeah, that's actually a good way to put it. The historical precedent.
Right.
Ultimately, what Randy is saying here is, I have what I believe is what I think everybody else has always believed. Anybody who's anybody, this is what they've always believed.
Right.
Well, that's mostly nonsense. So, the truth is decided by academic majority, or by Democratic majority.
So he just admitted that he cannot read the Word of God, interpret it for himself, but he must depend upon the widely accepted principles of interpretation because he can't do it.
Well, and this is the constant bait and switch. So yes, what you just said is exactly right. Randy can't. He's basically deferring his intellectual conclusions to somebody else. But if you call him on the fact that he is an automaton, he'll immediately get offended and start talking about how much he has studied, how much intellectual investment he already has. And so it's the both and proposition all over again. So they can be intellectually self-appointed, or they can be subordinate minds.
And what he's actually saying is his so-called objective standard is determined subjectively.
Yes, that's exactly what he is saying. And and trust me, Randy, again, I appreciate those of you who might say, hey, why are you picking on poor Randy? Randy is totally anecdotal. You will see this argument, he just happened to say it well, but you will see this argument leveled over and over and over. We saw it illustrated in the John Piper video. In 1 minute, he's intellectually appointed, and I am committed to the whole schema of the Calvinist doctrine. The next minute, well, my authority is the Bible.
The Bible.
Yeah, so he can bounce back and forth between intellectual self-appointment and his wholesale commitment to what previous minds have actually talked about. So you're going to see this over and over. Of course, the concept of truth being the byproduct of democratic majority is absurd. But this is a central theme of Calvinism and the dirty little secret of their preconception of orthodoxy. Reformation theology is a commitment to what everyone has always believed. Now, what I'm saying when I use the word here, everyone, I'm being facetious. It's in little Benny quotes. Because this is the classic myth in in historic Christian theology, that somehow everyone always believed this stuff. And it's just not true. I mean, we're not even within light years of this being true. It's only true in that alternate reality they want to consistently try to create. But the reality is, there has never been a time frame in all of human history where every Christian on the planet agreed with every single doctrine. It has never existed. What's that?
I don't know. During the medieval times, everyone agreed.
It had
Well,
If you were breathing.
but you could still be, during medieval times, you could be a lollard in one town and get crucified the next.
Yeah.
So the notion that there haven't been any theological disagreements,
Right.
that's the total myth here. And Reformed theologians like to pretend they're the only theological game in town, and they're just not. And it's only actually gotten worse, I'm going to talk about this here in a minute, as the Enlightenment came through and new studies began to emerge. It became very clear that they have never been the only theological game in town. So just for briefs, just for grins here, I'm going to actually go through a very high-level evaluation of interpretive events throughout history. So, interpretive history here, from the 1st century to roughly the 3rd century, there was no Bible to interpret. Didn't exist. From the 6th century to the 13th century, allegory was the primary interpretive
Right.
method.
Absolutely.
Thanks to Origin.
Yeah, thanks to Origin, that's exactly right. And when I say allegory, some people are like, what the heck are you talking about? Okay, so here's a prime example. If memory serves, through the Dark Ages, one of the allegories that I remember reading many, many years ago. So Jesus is talking to the disciples just prior to the crucifixion. And the first time he sent out the disciples, he said, don't take a sword, don't take a weapon, don't take food, just go do your thing. Then, just before he's going to go to the cross, he tells them this time, take food, and take swords. And the disciples go, here, I don't know why they decide this is important, but ultimately they come back and say, hey, Jesus, here's 2 swords. And Jesus says, that's enough, or that's sufficient, or whatever. Well, historically, the interpretation of this is that those 2 swords metaphorically represented the authority of the Spirit, or the power of the church to dictate spiritually, and then the other sword was metaphorical for government power. And this became central in the merging of historic spiritual with civil force and the merging of the church and the state. This became the justification. The justification was an allegory. And it's been forever since I've done this, but ultimately, you go back through and read some of the ancient interpretations of various passages, and every word out of a verse had some metaphysical, some metaphorical meaning, and that's how they arrived at all their doctrinal conclusions. Which is, of course, why this, of course, is fantastically subjective, and why the Pope ended up being in charge of what the Bible actually meant. It was ultimately a reaction to the methods used to determine what the Bible meant. So that was allegorical interpretive methodology. And then we get to systematic theology. This is of the Wayne Grudem kind. I'm going to fall asleep here if I mention his name. Has anybody ever heard that guy talk?
Yeah, I have.
Somebody sent me a video of him. This was hilarious. So they get up, they do this massive introduction of this guy, Wayne Grudem. And he's right now, well, he was a couple years ago, he was the poster child for all things Reformed theology, because he wrote a systematic theology book. And they got up, this big, rah, go Wayne. And he got up, and I want to tell you I was asleep in less than 30 seconds. I don't know what this guy does for a living, but hopefully he's not a radio broadcaster. Anyway, Wayne Grudem, the systematic theology, this is the current systematic, he's one of many. Millard Erickson, Henry Thiessen, the list of systematic theologians is long. Showed up, and this was actually, it showed up I think in the 14th century. And this is the process, you were supposed to say systematic theology. Say it, go.
Systematic theology.
Okay, yeah. So here's systematic theology. For those of you who don't know, my degree is in systematic and historical theology, so basically church history and historic church doctrine and systematic theology. And it's been forever since I've run through this, so I'm doing this off the top of my head, so don't, hate me too much. So systematic theology is broken down, I think, into what, 5, 6, or 7? Theology, pneumatology, eschatology, anthropology, soteriology, what? Christology. Christology, did I get them all? Anyway, each of those are, the prefix is like theos, God, logos, doctrine of. So doctrines of God, doctrines of end things, doctrines of the Spirit, doctrines of Christ, etc. So here's how this works. So once chapters and verses got applied to historic Bible texts, what they decided was they could go through and find references to say all the references of God throughout the Bible. And then they would compile them into this massive list and then do a generalized survey of all of those references and then conclude give whatever doctrinal conclusions there were. Well, first of all, the problem with this is that when the guys who wrote the books that ended up in our Bible, they didn't have chapters and verses in mind. They weren't subdividing their thoughts. They weren't like, so Daniel, yeah, this is the first chapter here, so make sure you put it verse 1 right here. And so everything that he now has, and it also presumes that you have the ability to take any book and read it in context to any other book. Well, this creates a fantastically bad interpretive standard, because that presumes that, say, what was written in the book of Deuteronomy necessarily can be read in conjunction with what's written in the book of Timothy or the Revelation or whatever. That they actually have this cross-pollination effect. And so what you end up with is this massive ability to cut and paste verses and string them together to make it mean whatever you want it to mean. Now, the widely accepted principles of interpretation that Randy's appealing to is in this systematic theology realm. And that's why one of the things that Calvinists immediately do is they start stacking up Bible verses. That's the first place they go. Why? Because in their mind, the way you interpret the Bible is by being able to take a passage in the Gospel of John and the passage out of Paul someplace and a passage over here in the book of Isaiah, sticking them together to create whatever doctrinal conclusion you want to drive at. And since they consider themselves, their mind, the authority, who can argue with the conclusion? Nobody. Actually, you saw this, it wasn't highlighted on the Piper video, but his preamble to his comment was why he's actually detailing why somebody is considered elect and why somebody is considered predestined. And he strings two verses together, almost back to back, with no recognition of its context or location. In his mind, it was perfectly reasonable to stick those two verses together to arrive at the conclusion of predestination. Well, and this is why you can never argue scriptures with Calvinists. Because at the end of the day, what they're employing is a fantastically subjective method of arriving at what they consider to be authoritative doctrine. Where was I? The last stage of interpretive history is modern-day higher critical methodology. Now, my subnote here is this is the endless parsing of Greek roots that so many Bible teachers are fond of. And I know this is your bailiwick. Okay, so here's what happens. The Enlightenment shows up. And I'm guaranteed what I'm going to say is going to offend some people. So the Enlightenment actually shows up, and people start applying real brain power to all these historic interpretive methods. And they start doing research on the times, the people, the locations, and the language where these events in what we now call the canon took place. And they started to learn a lot. They started to learn that what a given word meant in, say, Greek is not at all what we understood in, say, English. Or even more importantly, that highly likely things that Jesus said would have been in Hebrew and not Greek, and so the cultural distinctions between the two languages actually mattered. This is a super high level of evaluation of higher critical methodology, but you get the point. What ended up happening right around the 18th century is a lot of people started investing in what the real content and the makeup and the structure was of these books and what really happened in those books. And here's the thing, what they really finally realized was something in the Bible, quote unquote, can never mean what it was never intended to mean. The guy talking, what he intended it to mean matters. The people listening, what they would have understood matters. And the writer who actually compiled it, either on the spot or however many generations later that gave us the record that we had, all of those factors limit what an actual passage, what an actual chapter can really be about. Not least of which is just generally noticing that many, particularly chapters in the New Testament, fall dead square, the chapter breaks fall dead square in the middle of any given thought. And so while we in the 21st century like to assume that each chapter is somehow self-contained, in reality they are not. So what you ended up with is men like actually Frederick Schleiermacher. He was the man that I remember who actually started this trend of this evaluation, this high-level evaluation of what we call biblical content. And we haven't even gotten around to discussing the actual realities behind canon formation. And we have, there are effectively, I think, 4 fundamental respected authoritative canons. One's the Catholic, one's the Eastern Orthodox, and one is the Protestant version. All of them have different numbers of books. Andy?
Well, then it would seem then you probably don't have it on here, but then with the next logical progression following that, you get into the 19th century, and this is where you start getting into textual criticism. Because, so now that we've got people doing this critical methodology, evaluating text in the context that you just described, so now we get to the point where, well, are the manuscripts that we have actually the correct manuscripts?
I was actually subsuming that distinction in the whole discussion of higher critical methodology.
Okay.
And the fact of the matter is, there's no, in my semi-studied opinion, there is no way that anyone in the 21st century can ever make a claim to having something that's original.
Right.
It's not possible.
Well, my point is if you look at with every, and I don't want to get in, this is going to get off topic, so I don't want to get into this too deeply, but my point is every current modern translation of the Bible is based off either Westcott Hort or some derivative of Westcott, some later derivative of Westcott Hort.
Modern translations? What
Yes.
are we talking about? In the last, what, 50 years?
Last 100 years.
Okay.
Okay? King James doesn't use Westcott Hort, King James uses Textus Receptus. Two different manuscripts, and if you compare the two, they are
Dramatically different.
Dramatic differences, both in verb, not only in verb translation, but actual verb tenses, which radically changes the theology of many critical passages.
Well, and this
so
is...
my point is like, okay, so it almost seems as if the church's answer to this critical methodology, which is going to challenge their authority, then goes back to, well, let's see if we can find a way to challenge the sources themselves and say, well, we have these sources that say otherwise that support our view.
I don't think I have an opinion on that. That's an interesting argument. It wouldn't surprise me that that's true. I mean, in the modern age, in the modern age of Bible interpretation, it swings between what is called the literal translation versus what's called a free translation, and it's a spectrum. And so your ESV, I think, leans left of middle. Your average center of the road translation is your NIV, a combination of metaphorical, theological translation versus what is considered literal. Mm-hmm. Your free translation is something like say the Cotton Patch, which is an entire effort to take every word within a given within the Bible and turn it into something that would be colloquial to a given subset of readership, etc. So we have myriad choices, and they're all based on ultimately what happened here in the 18th century. Which, like I said, this is all Enlightenment engaged. All the tools that you have, all those cute little programs you have online, these are all byproducts of the Age of Reason and the Enlightenment. So ultimately, the answer here is, which one of these represents the definitive interpretive standard? Pick. And the fact of the matter is, when I asked this question, I actually wrote this specific thing in my comment to Randy. The answer is, he can't answer this. No Calvinist can, because at the end of the day, this is an intellectual black hole. You fall into this, you don't get out. Directly related to what Andy just said, here are my comments on my page here. We haven't begun to discuss the very long, convoluted process of translation from Hebrew to Greek to Latin to German to English, and the dozens of English variants that we currently have in the modern age. We haven't gotten to the part where a Protestant king decided to take a red pen to a whole bunch of books and make the current 66-book anthology in Protestant Christianity. The funny thing is, you say Apocrypha, and most Protestants think, ooh, that must have been witchcraft. He cut them out because it was too expensive to publish. It was originally published as an addendum. And those books still reside in the Catholic Bible. So how many leaps of infallible logic does a Calvinist have to make to arrive at the notion that they, sitting in the 21st century, in America, speaking English, with a laptop based Strong's Concordance, have to arrive at the final recitation of truth for all mankind? How many leaps of logic do you have to presume to get to that conclusion? Frankly, the arrogance here is stunning. You know, if we really are going to arrive at truth by democratic majority, then 1 billion Chinese can't be wrong. Buddha must be right, Confucius must have been right, because that's what everybody always believed by everyone, right? Islam, lots of people have believed in Islam. Evidently there are still a couple billion people on the planet that believe Islam is right, and everybody knows that's true. The earth must still be flat, because that truth was widely accepted. Right?
By Calvin and Luther.
By Calvin and Luther? Oh, I didn't know that.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, actually, I did remember that. Because
Yeah.
Luther got all fussed at Copernicus.
Well, in several places in the Calvin Institutes, Calvin rails on people who believe the earth is flat. Several places.
Well, there's another example of how many of Calvinists don't actually believe everything that Calvin said.
Right.
Right?
Yeah, it's a doozy.
Okay, so this is the C part. Again, if you didn't catch it online, I'm the one that put in A, B, and C. Randy didn't talk in chapter and verse. Okay, it is that standard I intend to rely on. So, they like to pretend they are intellectual giants and autonomous. But the center of Reformed theology orthodoxy is intellectual subordination. Do you see the fundamental problem? He's making a self-willed statement about where he gets his intellectual fidelity. I pick what I decide is the authority. Here's the problem. If you're a Calvinist and you preach submission to authority, you have no right to the words I think. No right to them. The moment those words come out of your mouth, you are betraying your own body of doctrine. What you should say is, I submit my mind to John Piper. Or I submit my mind to C.J. Mahaney. Or I submit my mind to Al Mohler. Or I submit my mind to Jonathan Edwards. At the end of the day, you have no right to the words I think. But that ultimately leads to the problem, well then whose mind am I submitting to? Well, that's the problem because they never want to answer this. What did I just say? Calvinist. I'm a Calvinist, but I don't necessarily believe everything that Calvin said. So is it Calvin's mind they submit to? Well, if today is Wednesday, maybe. Is it Luther's mind that I submit to? Well, if the moon is blue, maybe. So the intellectual pedigree equals, in Western thought, it's important that you understand this. This is what I've been hammering on now for the better part of 6 years. The intellectual pedigree goes like this. The Pythagoreans, remember way back when I told you that the soul-body dichotomy comes into Western thought with the Pythagoreans. It goes from the Pythagoreans to Plato to Plotinus. Plotinus is the one that grafted in the whole of the Pythagorean idea of the soul-body dichotomy. Flesh is so overwhelmingly fundamentally evil that it is totally irredeemable. This is where your concept of pervasive depravity originates. This has ultimately become what becomes Augustinian pervasive depravity. From Augustine we go to Luther, and from Luther we go to Calvin. So here is the dirty little secret. Calvinists are not independent thinkers. Not once, not ever. No matter how often Al Mohler wants to stand up and tell everybody that his job is to help Christians think. At the end of the day, he is not an independent thinker. All they have done is master the logic of better minds. And I've said this before, for all the evil that I think John Calvin represents, he was not a stupid man. The ability to synthesize what he synthesized in the format that he put it, the systematic presentation of the content of his ideas, it's a pretty fantastic intellectual achievement, but it's still an individual human achievement. All intellectual roads intersect at Luther and Calvin. Their root doctrines are the Heidelberg Disputation, that was the summary version of Reformed theology, and the Institutes of Christian Religion, the IRC, are the formal presentation, that 1,500 page book that John Piper decided he didn't want to have anything to do with. That is the formal framework of modern day Reformed theology. You pointed, did I?
It's right there.
Oh, is that it?
Right.
Well, that's the HCSB.
It's there back there.
Oh, it's behind me. Yes. Here we go. See it. Right here. This is the formal iteration of Reformed theology. However you want to parse down little bits and pieces you don't happen to agree with, at the end of the day, this is the heart and soul of all modern day 21st century Christianity. Every argument from, say, Al Mohler or Ligon Duncan or C.J. Mahaney or Tullian Tchividjian, did I pronounce his name right?
No.
Tullian Tchividjian?
Tchividjian. Like religion.
Dang it. Thought I got it right that time.
Just think religion. It's
Religion? Tchividjian. To your local pastor, to your mini tyrant overseeing your care group, They all have they're not original thinkers, and they all have their origins in the two men that I just said. This is why they accept no proof but their own proof. They need no proof. In their minds, it is synonymous, whatever's in their minds is synonymous with the truth. The truth is synonymous with whatever's in their minds. They accept no definition other than their own, because their mind is the doctrinal plumb line. They presume that they understand everything Bible correctly, and you don't. That's it. Their singular rationale, their singular rational standard is his subjective doctrinal assumptions. Actually, this is me changing my tense here. The singular rational understanding in Randy's mind was his doctrinal assumption. He reserves the sole right to determine what is biblical. And this is true of all Calvinists. They determine the sole right to determine what is biblical. So here we have it. Remember I told you we're going to start talking about where these arguments actually fit in context to my web of tyranny. And here we go. Since there is no such thing as objective truth, how then do Calvinists persuade? Well, the answer is they don't. They don't persuade. They compel. Calvinists can't make rational arguments. How can you make a rational argument when your fundamental premise is that the mind of man is corrupt? You can't. There is no such thing. What you think, what you believe is imputed to you by God. Right? So they must force people to agree, and they do this with authority. So here we have it. Remember I told you, everything the fulcrum of all their arguments is their right to define a different reality by use of compulsion. This is what these fundamental doctrines do. You are universally guilty of what? Sin, whatever that happens to be. And because everybody is guilty, they need someone to dictate what good is. Right? Those who dictate over people who are incompetent. You're intellectually incapable of understanding the truths that they understand. So ultimately, they have to dictate what you believe, and the thing that ties all these three together, every single sub-argument, is an appeal to their authority. You're guilty of sin, so you're deceived. You're deceived, so you need someone to dictate truth. And there it goes. That is the tautology within every argument they put out. So here's the thing. A few bold men will suggest that they have authority by virtue of their existence, but most people like to hedge. It goes like this. Here's how this hedge goes. I don't have authority. That book over there, it has the authority. They borrow the authority from the book. Pay attention here. They don't want to pretend, they don't want to suggest that they have it. Now, a few bold men will. James McDonald, he's not too shy, right? He'll say, I got it, buddy. You owe me your intellectual fealty. And there are other men that will do the same thing. But at the end of the day, a lot of people don't, it takes some real cojones to go, hey, you know what, I'm the guy. So what they usually do is they like to pretend they're very humble. I don't have authority. That book over there does. And I'm reading what that says. And we've already addressed the nonsense behind that. So here's the rebuttal. Books don't have force. Men use force. The Bible doesn't have any authority. It can't reach up and swat you upside the head by itself. If you're going to get hit, you're going to get hit by a man. A man is what's going to use force to compel you to think and believe whatever it is they want you to think and believe. Any appeal to authority is really the moral right to use force. And this is the key concept, moral authority. And this is the pretense the Calvinists use with impunity, the expectation of their own moral virtue. Man is pervasively depraved, right? All men commit sin, right? How can pervasively depraved men make a claim to any morality? The answer is they can't, right? You can never say, if you're pervasively depraved, that you have any ability to take moral action. So here's how this works. Here's how they get around this. So individual men will sin But groups of men will sin less because they're in a group. This is why you get that whole first among equals business that they like to talk about. We got a group of eldership. We have an eldership or an apostolic team that gets together. The logic being that each individual would actually commit sin, but if they're part of the group will somehow keep each other accountable. You've heard this before, right? So preachers are pretty good at marketing and packaging this, and so we kind of like the concept that this group of elders, this group of people is somehow mutually responsible to keep each other from sinning. They pretend that they are innocent bystanders in this cosmic predestination of truth. So God held this kind of celestial draft over here, and so they picked him. And now you're part of this group. And oh, woe is me, I really wasn't supposed to be part of it, but I am, so I have to bear the burden. I have to suffer for you. But here's the sleight of hand. The revelation is the authority, and they are mere servants of the authority. These mere servants are claiming to have a dispensation from the very moral corruption that obligates you to their control. So you're corrupt, you're morally depraved, you're intellectually incompetent. But these guys over here, they have an exemption from all that. Somehow they get to magically get all the right answers. And because they magically get all the right answers, they get to tell you what you got to do. So here we are. Dictated good, incompetent masses. You're incompetent. Somehow they get a dispensation from the universal guilt and the incompetence, and they get to tell you what to do. But the reality is, if you believe in pervasive depravity, you still have to overcome depravity. So the intellectual hedge goes like this. Individuals are flawed, therefore to prevent individual error, we will join a group for checks and balances. In essence, we, the group, will borrow each other's righteousness. Remember a minute ago I told you they want to borrow the authority of the book to apply it to themselves. Now they're going to actually borrow the righteousness of other people. So what is wrong with this? Anybody want to take a whack? What's wrong with this logic?
They've already said they don't have any.
Keep going.
How can you borrow what you don't have?
That is exactly right. So let's work down this list. It presumes that groups can't be wrong, which we all know that's nonsense. A group is always one man or woman. If the constituent part is singular, and so we have constituent parts of singulars, they get put together. So first among equals is a total fiction. Every group ends up, the loose logic is that the group is somehow led by some uber person that's individual, but he's part of a group of equals. But that's also nonsense because that never happens. It always ends up coming back to one person. How did the group arrive at the substance of ethical action? So if you start out with the premise that no man can know what good is, how is it that you get together and suddenly have an understanding of what good is? How is that possible? Did someone had to identify it? Someone had to measure good action, so there was a qualification to join the group. And this is the bait and switch they are constantly putting on. Remember I showed you the both and proposition, the endless violation of the law of identity. One minute they're immoral, wretched beasts, and the next minute they are, because they're part of a group, they are now moral people borrowing their righteousness from each other. Reformed theology says that man overtly rejects good, but somehow a group of preachers possess good. So riddle me this. If man is hostile to God, how can a group of men be benevolent towards God? If man cannot measure his own moral action, how can he measure a group's moral consensus? If individual men are moral and intellectual cripples, how does a group become rational giants and paragons of virtue? The answer? It is insane to argue that a group of totally depraved men are qualified to define morality. The folks in the asylum are not less insane because they are in the same geographic location. What am I hearing?
My son. He left his door open.
Group morality means morality is proximity. Let me say that again because that's really good. Group morality means morality is nothing more than proximity. You can't borrow another person's moral action. Here's the root error. This is all a violation of the law of identity. Individual sinners, but groups of sinners do not sin. A equals B. They must borrow an authority they do not have in morality, and a morality they can never possess. So here are the takeaways. Calvinists evade reality because reality is their enemy. If A is A, then their doctrine collapses. Calvinists can make no claim to objective truth. Calvinists must evade their own intellectual processes. Calvinists are not independent thinkers. You should not fear their arguments. I'm going to say that again. Calvinists are not independent thinkers. You should not fear their arguments. Far too often, people grant them way too much latitude. They approach them with way too much caution. Calvinists do not have morality, so you should never fear their moral condemnation. By definition, a Calvinist can never make a claim to morality. Therefore, when he's lobbing moral insults in your direction, he's the fraud, not you. Calvinists have no authority because they do not have the right to compel you to think anything. Calvinists are morally bankrupt. Here's a test. The next time you hear a Calvinist say, he's usually wheedling and trying to pretend he's humble, and he starts talking about how much of a wretched sinner he is, agree with him. You know what? You're right. You are. You're a wretched moral sinner. You're an evil man. And watch how fast they argue their own moral virtue. All right. I'm going to extend my invitation once again for you to play Stump the Bartender. If you have arguments that you've heard out of Calvinists, write them out for me. If you're online, send them to Paul. And I will try to place them in here, and I'll try to get to the root of what I think that argument looks like. Thank you very much.